In this example, I want to look at AWS's IAM service, and IAM stands for Identity and Access Management. And that can better be thought of as user account management and then their privileges and permissions to what resources they'd have within the AWS ecosystem. So I have an account. I have AWS account I've created, and I'm going to go ahead and sign into that account in the AWS console. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and log in. This is the account that I initially used to create my AWS, I guess, my AWS user account. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and sign in. And I want to have a discussion about that user account that I created. And the idea with that user account that I created to sign into this AWS service is that that account represents me as an individual for this class, but it also represents the account that's used to manage my organization that is using AWS. So I don't want you to think of that as your individual account. I want you to think of that as your business that's going to use AWS. And from there, you are going to have other accounts, and you might have other employees and they'd have accounts, or you might have web applications that run with specific accounts. So you're going to have many different AWS accounts to access the different AWS services. The AWS account that you used to initially create access and get access to the AWS console is considered your root user account. You sign in with your email typically, and you had to enter a credit card, and that's the account that's responsible for all the billing information. That's your root user account. That account has administrative privileges to everything within the AWS console. Okay, most of the accounts that we're going to have within AWS should not have administrative access to all of the different services within AWS. They shouldn't be able to create S3 buckets or EC2 instances, or basically the idea here is that we want to implement a policy that's going to restrict access as much as possible and still allow people to do their jobs. Okay, so we're logged in with the root user account, and I'm going to go into IAM. And this is where you would manage your user accounts. So you can see I've kind of cleaned things out a little bit. So I have 0 users, 0 groups, but I have some managed policies and I have some roles. Those are from other services that I've enabled over in the past. My guess is that you see 0 customer managed policies and 0 roles, unless you've kind of worked within the AWS ecosystem before. But the key here is that we have 0 users and 0 groups. And I'm getting a security alert right now saying that the root user account does not have multi-factor authentication enabled. So what I want to do is I want to enable multi-factor authentication for this root user account. So basically it's like a 2-factor authentication. So I'm going to log in with my email and password, and then I'm also going to have a 6-digit code that's sent to my device. So I have Microsoft Authenticator set up within my iPhone, and Microsoft Authenticator is available on iOS and Android, so you can download that application, and that's how you can connect them. So I'm going to enable MFA on this account. So I'm activating MFA. I have a virtual MFA device, so I have an Authenticator app that's installed on my phone. So that's what I'm going to use. So I'll go ahead and continue. And now I'm supposed to show my QR code and I can scan that in. So I'm going to go ahead and scan that in within my Authenticator app. Okay, and that's there now. And now I'm supposed to type in 2 consecutive codes, and the codes change every 30 seconds, and the code just changed. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the first code, and then I'll grab the second code. And it's counting down here, so 15 seconds away from getting a second code. So I'll get that second code, and then it'll verify that I have that MFA device correctly set up. Okay, and now I have a new code, and I can assign that MFA. Okay, so now I have that multi-factor authentication, and I'll show you what that looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and sign out, and then I can log back in. And now the only way I can log back in is with my email and password, and it must not have taken effect yet. So let me go ahead and sign out, and I'm actually going to close Chrome here, and then I'll go ahead and restart Chrome, and I'll go back to the AWS console, because it should not have looked like that. It should not have allowed me in with just a username and password. Now you'll see that I'm getting my MFA login, and I have to type in that code that's presented within my Authenticator app. Okay, so now I have two-factor authentication set up on my AWS root account. Okay, so now I'm in with my root account, and like I said, it's an administrative account that has access to all of the AWS services. Specifically, though, I want to look at IAM and what we can do with IAM. Okay, so right now we have 0 users and 0 groups. Ideally, we're just getting started, but ideally what would happen is if I'm going to be working within AWS and the AWS console, I'm not typically using the AWS root user account to do that. So the root user account has access to everything. I really don't want to manage AWS using my root user account. I'd rather have an administrative account that's responsible for that. So I'm going to go ahead and create a user. So I'm going to add a user called B. Witkowski, and I'm going to give B. Witkowski both programmatic access and console access. So I can choose one or the other, or I can choose both. I'm going to choose both. Okay, and I'm going to have a custom password. I'm just going to make it. And I'm not going to change it. And you'll see that it does not conform to my password policy. So I'm going to go ahead and use a complex password here. And I don't want to change my password, so I have that password. And it's going to walk me through a wizard-like template where I'm changing the permissions. So right now it's saying I can add users to a group, I can copy permissions from an existing user, or I can attach policies directly. I'm just going to avoid all of that. And then the next step says, do you want to add some keys and values? These key value pairs are completely optional. Where they come into play, and you'll see this throughout all of the AWS services, is what I can do is I could say, maybe I want to set a department. And I could say, you know, the department is IT. And then I could say a specific project, cloud for developers. And then the idea would be that these key value pairs will then show up on my bill. So as I start to generate costs within the AWS ecosystem, I can say I want to run a report for all the costs associated with this project named Cloud for Developers. Or I want to see all of the costs that are associated to the department IT or marketing or whatever. So you can kind of get an idea there. They're completely optional. You don't have to have them, but then what these do is they then allow you to kind of organize your bill based on those tags. Okay, and you'll notice that I get to the end of this wizard to create a user account, and it tells us that the user account has no permissions. Okay, so we had checked that they should have programmatic access and console access, but right now it's giving us this warning saying this user has no permissions, and that's okay. So we're going to go ahead and create the user. Okay, so I've created the user. I'm going to go ahead and close this. And what I'm going to do then is I'm going to sign out. And now I got a couple of options. So if I log back in, okay, it's saying I can log in with my root user account. So you'll see this root user sign in and ask for an email and a password. If I do that, I'm going to have the multi-factor authentication prompt. So you'll see that. And now I have to punch in the authenticator code, that 6-digit code. Okay, and you'll see that I'm in as that administrative account. However, if I go back to IAM, I can also sign in using this sign-in URL. Okay, and I have an alias for this, so B. Witkowski is my alias. I can delete that alias. And then what it is it basically gives me an account unique identifier. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that to my clipboard, and I'm going to sign out as my administrative account. Okay, so now I've signed out as my administrative account. I've copied that console login. And now you'll see that it's not asking for my root user account. It's asking for an IAM user account. Okay, so now I have two options to sign in. I actually have two user accounts. I have the user account that I use to create my AWS service, that is the account administrator, the root user account. Within that account, I now have a user account, so B. Witkowski, that I just set up, that has a password. And multi-factor authentication is not enabled on that account. If you remember, AWS was saying that that account did not have any permissions to do anything. Okay, so if I try to go into IAM now with this B. Witkowski account, it's going to say, hey, you don't have any access. So get account summary, list account aliases. It's running into all sorts of issues because this account does not have permission to do anything. Okay, and that's going to be for all of the AWS services. So if I try to go to EC2, you'll notice that I get errors. If I try to go to S3, I'm going to get a bunch of errors. And all throughout the AWS ecosystem, I do not have permission to do anything. I get errors saying I don't have permission to do that. And that's because I'm now running an account that doesn't have permission to do anything. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to sign back in with my root user account. Okay, and I want to sign in with my root user email. So there's a link right here. And I'll go ahead and sign in. And it's going to use my multi-factor authentication again. Okay, and we can go back to IAM and we can see that user account that does not have permission to do anything right now. Okay, so it shows the password age, it's today, last activity was today, MFA is not enabled on this account, so I can enable it on this account, but it's critically important that we enable MFA on our root user account. Okay. However, I don't want to administer all of my AWS actions using my root user account. I want to use this B. Witkowski user account to administer everything within AWS. Right now, I don't have permission to do that, so I want to add that permission. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this user. And you can see there's no permissions. I can add permissions. So right now I can do that. So I'm going to add permissions. And it says, hey, you don't have a group. I could attach policies directly. That's what I want to do. And what I want to do is I want to grant administrator access. Okay, so it's a managed policy. I'm adding that administrative access. So now this B. Witkowski user account is an administrator. Okay, and we can check that out because remember, when I logged out in the past, that account didn't have access to anything. Okay, so we should be able to go back to the dashboard. We have that council login. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that to my clipboard again. And this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up and I'm going to open an incognito window so that I can sign in my incognito instance with the B. Witkowski user account, and I can leave the root user account up in my normal Google Chrome window. So I'm going to go ahead and open that new incognito window and paste in that console. And I'll sign in with the B. Witkowski user account that does not have multi-factor authentication enabled. And now, because I've made it a administrative account, they have administrative access, we should now be able to go into S3 and see the various buckets that are in S3. Okay, so you'll notice that I'm not getting any information about there being a problem accessing S3. And same thing for EC2, I think we tried to go into. Okay, you'll see that I have some key pairs, I have an instance, I have a security group, I have some volumes. I'm able to get in, and before we were getting errors kind of across the board trying to look at this EC2 instance. If I try to go into IAM, you'll see that I can see the exact same thing that my root user account was able to see. I'm able to see that there's one user and there are no groups. I'm able to go into that account and see that that account has administrative access. So kind of life is good there. I would suggest that the way I set this up is working, but maybe not optimally. And what I mean by that is the general best practice is that we do not want to attach policies directly to user accounts. Okay, so our job role as an administrator, and we might have multiple system administrators within the IT department. So if I have a large IT department, there might be a lot of people that are administrators of AWS. So let's assume that there's maybe 10 people that all have kind of that same administrative job role, and they all need administrative access to the AWS services. I don't want to have permissions attached to each individual account. I'd rather have a group that has permissions. So an administrative group called administrators would probably be a good name, that has the different access attached to it, and then I can make the user accounts part of that group. Okay, so I'd argue that the way this is set up is probably wrong at this point. And the correct way to set it up would be to, let's go back over to the administrative account. So I want to go to the I want to go to the root user account. I want to set up my own group. So I'm going to create a new group called administrators or admins. Okay, and what I want to do is I want to give all of my admins administrator access. And then I'm going to go ahead and create the group. Okay, and right now, the group that we just created has administrator access, but there are no users associated with this group. So what I can do is I can click on the group and I can add users to the group. Alternatively, I could do it the other way. So right now I'm through groups and I'm looking at a particular group, and you can see I can add users to the group. Alternatively, I could have gone to the user and I can go into groups and I can add the user to a group. Okay, so you can see basically it's kind of a bi-directional thing where I can add users to a group or I can add a group to a user. Either way is going to work essentially the same. Okay, so now that user account has or belongs to that admins group. And that user account is getting permission through the admins group. And right now I have it set up both ways, where I have the policy attached directly to the user account, but then I also have the policy attached from the group. And what I'm going to suggest is that we do not want to attach it directly. We want to have policies attached from the group. So I'm going to remove the direct access. And then because they're part of the administrators group, they still have that same administrator access. This is the more correct implementation of that policy being attached to the user account. The policy is not attached to the user account, it's attached to the group, and then that user belongs to the group. Okay, so the group is more like job function that has the necessary policies, and then subsequently those user accounts will then have access to the different AWS resources. Okay, one thing I will point out with these policies, so we haven't really looked at these permissions, but if I want to attach a policy directly, you can see there's some policies here, right? There's a whole bunch of them actually for all of the different AWS services. And usually if you want to search, so S3 is going to be one of the first services that we look at within AWS. So if I just type in S3, you'll see that there's a couple of permissions that we would kind of understand. So Amazon S3 full access obviously gives you full access to S3. And then there's S3 read-only access, which obviously gives you permission to read the various buckets and objects within S3, but it doesn't allow you to create new buckets or add new resources. And then there's a couple of others that may or may not make sense. What you will notice, though, is these policies are not granular at the service level. Okay, and this takes some explaining, but I want to go over to my incognito window. And if I go to S3, and like I said, we'll cover S3, but right now I'm assuming that we haven't covered S3. But if I go into S3, basically I have 6 buckets here. So 6 different buckets that are created within S3. And it might make some sense to say a group of users can access the brianwitkowski.com bucket, but maybe cannot access Brian's Madison College website bucket. So I might want to give access to some users for one bucket and not the other, or vice versa. So I want to be able to be more granular about S3 and say certain users can access certain buckets and other users can't access those buckets. And what you'll notice from the permissions is that doesn't exist here. Okay, and what ends up happening is that we, as developers and administrators of AWS, have to then get into policy management. So right now, these are kind of the default policies that are built into AWS, and they are specific to the AWS services. But within the AWS services, you are responsible for creating those resources. So in the case of S3, I'm responsible for naming and creating the S3 buckets. Amazon has no idea what names I'm going to choose or what access I want to give to which groups and things like that. So what ends up happening is instead, I can create my own policies. Okay, and I can choose a service. So I could say I'm talking about the S3 service, and then I get to choose the actions, and I get to choose the resources, and I get to choose the conditions. And basically what's happening is I'm creating my own policy on the granular level or on the individual object level within the service that I'm in charge of, that I manage. Okay, so I can get really defined and really, the term that I want to use is granular, but I always hated that term as a student. But granular is the correct term. I can kind of isolate the individual resources within a service and say what particular access a group has. And it might not be full access, and it might be full access, or it might be access to certain objects and not other objects, and it might be, a combination of all of those things. Okay, so we can start to generate our own policies, and that's what we'll kind of look at going forward. But for now, the idea is we're looking at IAM, and at this point in time, we want to be able to create users and understand that these users are different than our root user account, meaning there's some restrictions placed on these users that are not placed on our root user account. So this account is different. We want an account that is a non-root user account that can administer our AWS services. So ideally, we're going to have a user account that has administrative access. We granted that administrative access not by attaching the policy directly to the user account, but we did that by creating a group, and that group has administrator access. Okay, so we can see that administrator access is attached to the group. And then that group has our one user account. And that's what's allowing that user account to then administer our AWS services. And at this point, because I have that administrative account, I really don't have a need to use my root user account to administer AWS. And in fact, I generally don't want to. Okay, so the idea is that I'm typically going to avoid logging into the console with my root user account. I'm typically going to use this administrative account to manage my AWS services that I need to manage. Occasionally, you might want to log in with the root user account, and I say that because you might want to look at your billing dashboard, and your root user account is going to allow you to do that, to kind of see the charges that you've incurred, just to kind of make yourself feel comfortable with the things that you're doing within this class. So you'll see that I have a bill for Route 53 because I host my domain there. And then I've been playing around with EC2 a little bit on and off over break. So that's where that charge came from. Okay, so typically I don't have any EC2 charge, and I typically have a 50 cent a month charge for Route 53. But really, the costs for this class should be really minimal in terms of what services that we're using throughout the semester. Just to kind of close out on that note, that's typically why I'm logging in with the root user account, is to just kind of get a quick glance at my billing dashboard to make sure that a lot of times when we're playing around with the AWS services and just kind of exploring things, I want to make sure that those resources get cleaned up at the end of the day. So maybe I'm using the resources to complete a lab, and then I no longer have a need to use those resources. I want to make sure that those resources get cleaned up so that I'm not getting billed, and my billing dashboard is where I'd see that. So in order to see the billing dashboard, I'm going to log in with the root user account, okay? But typically, I'm not having to log in with the root user account unless I want to take a look at this. Okay, so this is kind of how I want to end the discussion of IAM for this video.